All right, let's jump right into this explainer. Today, we're zeroing in on one of the most extreme, but honestly kind of overlooked hazards in the entire global economy, mining waste. You know, when we extract the metals that literally power our modern world, think copper for your smartphone or iron for our skyscrapers, we also generate colossal, mind-boggling amounts of hazardous leftover material. And storing all that safely, well, that's an engineering challenge of epic proportions. So today, we're going to see exactly how the metals and mining industry uses these incredibly strict, standardized frameworks to defuse what a lot of experts consider to be massive ticking time bombs.
Here's a quick look at our roadmap for today. We'll start with the ticking time bomb, then move into tracking the giants, followed by engineering and independent reviews. After that, we'll look at governance and executive accountability, then emergency preparedness plans, and finally, diffusing the threat.
Okay, let's dive into Section 1, the ticking time bomb. We need to look at the high stakes of mining waste.
So to really grasp the risk here, we have to talk about Tailings Storage Facilities, or TSFs. Listen, these are not your average industrial waste bins. Not even close. We are talking about monumental, absolutely sprawling structural dams built to hold back literally millions of cubic meters of waste streams. And this isn't just dirt and water, right? The extraction process uses chemicals for things like leaching and flotation. So these facilities are often holding potentially harmful slurries and sludges that present a massive long-term threat to human health and groundwater if they aren't managed with absolute flawless precision.
The crucial takeaway here is that when it comes to the structural integrity of these dams, it's a zero-tolerance game. The source material is very clear. A catastrophic failure like a major dam breach releases a literal tidal wave of toxic waste right into the environment. It completely devastates ecosystems, destroys human livelihoods, and can absolutely cripple local economies. And for the mining companies, we're talking catastrophic financial losses, massive legal liabilities, and practically losing their entire social license to operate.
Right, so now that we understand the incredibly high stakes, let's move to Section 2, tracking the giants, and look at the SASB requirement for transparency.
So the first layer of defense here is absolute forced transparency. The Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, or SASB, has a specific metric, EMMM 540A1, that mandates incredibly detailed disclosures for how these facilities are managed. It totally removes the guesswork. Mining companies are required to publicly disclose a highly detailed inventory of every single tailings facility they've got. And that means active sites, inactive ones just under maintenance, and even the fully closed ones.
And what's super interesting here is the actual format they have to use, the standardized Tailings Storage Facility Inventory Table. They can't just hand in some vague, rosy summary, no way. This is a rigid, mandatory framework. From the facility's exact name and location, down to ownership status and maximum capacity, this table forces these companies to lay bare the exact status and real risks of their waste sites. And it does it in a way that investors, regulators, and local communities can clearly track year after year.
So what exactly is in that table? Well, companies have to track some really critical data points. They must disclose the exact construction method, like was the dam built upstream, downstream, or centerline. They have to declare a consequence classification, which basically assesses exactly how devastating it would be if that specific facility were to fail. They track the max permitted storage capacity right alongside the actual current quantity of tailings sitting in there. And crucially, they have to publicly disclose if any recent independent technical reviews found any material safety issues.
And that brings us perfectly to our next layer of defense. Section 3, engineering and independent reviews. This is all about monitoring structural integrity.
The Global Industry Standard on Tailings Management, or GISTM, which the SASB standard actually leans on pretty heavily, requires this continuous, unyielding loop of monitoring. It's intense. First, you've got ongoing engineering systems that constantly, 24/7, verify the design assumptions and hunt for any potential failure modes. Then, you layer in frequent, highly structured risk assessments. And finally, independent technical reviews. And these must be done by third-party experts who had absolutely nothing to do with designing or running the facility. It basically guarantees an unbiased, fresh set of expert eyes looking for any tiny sign of structural weakness.
But hey, what happens when those outside experts do find a problem? Well, enter ALRP, which stands for as low as reasonably practicable. If a safety review flags a material finding, companies actually have to disclose whether they've implemented mitigation measures to reduce that risk down to an ALRP level. Basically, they are legally and procedurally bound to take immediate, practical action to neutralize the threat. It's not just about, finding the cracks, it's about mandating the fix. Of course, none of this engineering happens for free. Someone has to approve the budgets and make the really tough calls. So let's look at Section 4, Governance and Executive Accountability. The chain of command.
This standard forces a crystal clear chain of command. There's a rigid escalation of accountability for a facility's stability. It traces responsibility starting straight from the site-level mine manager, right up through the executive leadership, all the way to the very top, the board of directors. There is absolutely no room for finger-pointing or the CEO claiming ignorance. The board is structurally fundamentally accountable for the systems that prevent these catastrophic failures.
And accountability isn't just about oversight meetings, right? It's about having the actual cash to back it up. Executives are forced to frequently prove they have adequate financial capacity, including comprehensive insurance, to safely manage these sites. And get this, it doesn't just cover the active mining years. They have to prove they have the funds for planned closure, a sudden early closure, land reclamation, and the perpetual post-closure monitoring of these facilities. Literally, they have to prove they can afford to keep this bomb diffused forever.
Okay, so we've covered the engineering and the executives. Now we reach the final, and honestly, maybe the most critical ring of defense. Section 5. Emergency Preparedness Plans. Planning for the worst.
Because we really have to pause and ask ourselves this terrifying question. Dams are built by humans. And humans, well, we make mistakes. So despite all this incredibly robust engineering, all those independent reviews, the board-level oversight, what actually happens if the worst occurs? This is where the strict requirements for emergency preparedness and response plans, or EPRPs, come into play.
The standards draw a really sharp, hard line between a mine operating in a vacuum and one acting responsibly. You simply cannot develop a valid emergency response plan in isolation. The standard mandates active stakeholder engagement. The mining company absolutely must coordinate its EPRPs with local public sector agencies, first responders, and local authorities. Literally everyone in the potential blast radius needs to be on the exact same page.
Because let's be real, if you want to actually minimize the consequences of a dam failure, just having a dusty binder sitting on a shelf somewhere is nowhere near enough. These emergency plans have to be highly site-specific. The local stakeholders need to be actively prepared. And this is a big one. Companies must run frequent physical emergency response tests and coordinated evacuation exercises. They literally have to drill the absolute worst-case scenario over and over. So if that structure ever gives way, the community knows exactly where to go and what to do. It literally saves lives.
All right, let's bring all these distinct pieces together. Section 6, Diffusing the Threat, Building a Shield of Prevention.
When you look at it, safely managing these massive tailings storage facilities is really about stacking interconnected layers of defense. First, you start with that forced transparency and the public inventory. Then you wrap that tightly in continuous engineering monitoring and independent technical reviews. You secure that with top-level executive governance and real financial accountability. And finally, you backstop the whole shebang with rigorous community-drilled emergency preparedness. It takes all 4 of these layers working perfectly in tandem to successfully diffuse the threat.
The SASB source material really hits the nail on the head here. It says, robust approaches to tailings facilities design, management, operation, and closure can help prevent such incidents from occurring. And that's exactly it. When they are executed correctly, comprehensively, and totally transparently, these stringent standards are the literal things preventing a ticking time bomb from detonating. They are the fragile line between a safely contained industrial site and a totally catastrophic ecosystem collapse.
Which leaves us with one final, pretty heavy thought to consider today. We are living in an era where the global demand for extracted metals, for our EV batteries, our infrastructure, the entire renewable energy transition, is absolutely skyrocketing. And more mining inevitably means more of this hazardous waste. So as the immense pressure to extract more resources intensifies globally, will the mining industry's commitment to these vital layers of defense hold strong enough to protect our future? It is a delicate balance, and honestly, it's one we all have a very real stake in watching closely. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep asking the big questions.